The sun baked the land in heavy silence, drawing long shadows over the rust-colored earth as it slid behind the jagged ridgelines of the New Mexico territory. The year was 1873, and the land stretched wide and empty, carrying the weight of stories buried in blood, bone, and dust. Thomas Grady moved with quiet purpose, his boots crunching through brittle weeds as he repaired the warped gate to his corral. At 37, he was a man carved from isolation, tall, broad-shouldered, and worn down like the timber posts he hammered each day. His once black hair now threaded with gray, his skin sun-hardened, and his eyes, deep-set and tired, spoke of a life scorched by loss. A cross stood behind the cabin, half hidden by sagebrush. No flowers, no date. Just weathered wood leaning eastward, where his wife had been buried after the fever took her 3 winters ago. Grady spoke little these days. There was no one to listen except an old cattle dog with a limp and the dry wind that carried the scent of mesquite and distant rain. The ranch was a quiet thing now, stubbornly clinging to the edges of survival. His herd had thinned, water had grown scarce, and the nearest neighbor was 4 hours east on horseback. The world had narrowed to fence lines, dust, and the taste of silence. What few settlers remained kept their rifles close and their minds closed tighter. The war with the Apache was over in name only. No treaty could erase what men had seen or done. Mistrust had sunk its claws into every homestead, every glance exchanged on the dusty road into town. It was late afternoon when he first saw her. Grady had been walking the ridgeline above the property, checking for signs of coyotes or broken posts, when something unnatural caught his eye, a blotch of color in the ochre landscape. He stopped, squinted. There, slumped near the water trough beside the barn, was a figure. Small. Still. He raised his rifle automatically, instincts sharpened by years of solitude and hard truth. He descended the hill slowly, boots sinking into the sand, his breath measured. Each step rang louder in the quiet. It was a girl. Apache. Her skin was the color of sun-burnished copper, her hair black and tangled, clinging to her dirt-streaked cheeks. She looked barely 16, though life out here aged children fast. Blood darkened the fabric on her left side, trailing from somewhere beneath the ribs. Her lips were cracked. One arm clutched her side, the other lay limp at her side. Her eyes flickered open as he neared. Fear and exhaustion stared back at him. She tried to speak but only managed a rasp, barely audible. Water. He stood motionless for a beat, rifle still in hand. She shouldn't be here. No camps nearby, no riders on the horizon. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the open land, heart thudding. He knew what could follow a wounded Apache child. A rescue. A retaliation. Or a test. His gaze dropped to her again. She was shaking now, her lips pale, one hand weakly reaching toward the trough just feet away. Grady knelt, not fully aware of the choice he was making. He unscrewed the cap of his canteen and held it to her mouth. She drank greedily at first, then coughed, water spilling down her chin. He eased her back, glanced at the wound, deep, angry, raw. Torn, not clean. A bullet maybe. Or a fall. He didn't ask. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her breath shallow, eyes fluttering like broken wings. The part of him that wanted to survive said leave her. But something older, something deeper, buried beneath years of hurt and silence, overruled it. He lifted her carefully, cradling her thin body in arms that had once held his dying wife. She weighed almost nothing. Her blood seeped through his shirt as he carried her inside. The dog barked once but didn't rise. The house was cool and dim, shuttered against the heat. Grady cleared the table, laying her down gently on the thick wool blanket he pulled from the rocker. She stirred, groaned, but didn't wake. He moved with method, boots thudding softly across floorboards as he gathered what little he had, an old bottle of rye whiskey, scraps of clean cloth, a rusting tin needle threaded with coarse thread. He cleaned the wound in silence, teeth clenched as she spasmed once, twice, but didn't scream. She had grit. Apache children were taught to swallow pain. He stitched her slowly, carefully, whispering things he hadn't said aloud in years. Almost done, girl. Hang on now. The light faded outside. Coyotes yipped in the distance, echoing through the canyons. He wrapped her ribs with the last of the linen and sat back, sweating, hands stained dark. She lay still, chest rising in shallow breaths, the flicker of firelight dancing over her brow. Grady poured himself a measure of whiskey, sat on the edge of the hearth, and watched her. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't wept. She had just appeared. And now she was in his home, bleeding into the floorboards. The ranch felt different with her there, less empty, but more uncertain. He couldn't say why he'd brought her inside. Was it guilt? Duty? Some piece of his better self, still intact after all these years? He didn't know. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That the stillness of his world had cracked. The sky beyond the window was starless now. Heavy. Watching. Waiting. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring dust across the yard. Grady glanced toward the dark ridgeline. The land was too quiet. He drained the rest of his drink and looked down at the girl again. Her lips moved. He leaned closer, barely catching the word. Name. Taya. Grady sat back, the sound of her voice still lingering like smoke in the air. He didn't respond. Didn't ask anything more. But he knew nothing would be the same come morning. Dawn broke with a ghostly hush, casting pale gold across the cracked windows of the ranch house. Inside, the girl hadn't moved. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Grady stood by the stove, slowly ladling hot water into a basin, watching steam rise like mist in the dim room. The silence wasn't the same as before. It was weighted now, fragile, stretched thin between two strangers with nothing to say and too much to lose. He glanced toward her again, unsure if she'd wake at all, unsure what would happen if she did. When her eyes finally opened, there was no fear in them, only exhaustion and the haunted stillness of someone who'd seen too much too fast. She tried to sit, winced, and leaned back again. Grady stepped forward, carefully placing a tin cup of broth beside her. She eyed it warily but said nothing. "You'll tear the stitches if you move," he muttered. "Eat if you can. You need strength." Her hand trembled as she reached for the cup. She sipped slowly, eyes never leaving him. Grady watched her, taking in every detail. The way her fingers curled protectively around the tin. The deliberate silence. The way her eyes flicked toward the door, as if gauging escape. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then spoke with a voice roughened by days without water. "Taya." He nodded once. "Grady." Neither of them smiled. There was no need for pleasantries between people who understood danger lived close. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't ask who'd hurt her. Not yet. The land didn't run on questions, it ran on caution. By midday, she was sitting up against the wall. Her face remained expressionless, but he saw the flickers, narrowed eyes when a floorboard creaked, a sharp glance at the knife on the table. She was calculating everything. Survival made her sharp, like broken glass beneath a thin cloth. He left her alone and went outside, the old dog trailing behind him. The sun was high and merciless, dragging heat out of the rocks. He repaired a section of the corral fencing, hammering slowly, each strike echoing across the empty land. His thoughts wandered more than his eyes. She was young, too young to be out here alone, wounded, with no horse or gear. He wondered what had brought her this far. More than that, he wondered what might come looking for her. When he returned near sundown, Taya was standing just inside the door, leaning on a broom for balance. She didn't speak. Just looked at him, eyes unreadable. He saw how her shoulders stiffened, how her fingers pressed the wood hard as if she might strike with it if pushed. He gestured to the stool. She didn't move. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, voice low. "You helped me," she replied simply, as if stating a fact. "I did." "Why?" He didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. He scratched his jaw, exhaled. "Didn't seem right to let you die." She studied him, then sat slowly, never taking her eyes off him. He stoked the fire and handed her half a biscuit. They ate in silence. Outside, the wind started to rise. That night, she didn't sleep near the hearth. Instead, she curled into a corner of the room, wrapped in the same blanket he'd used to carry her inside. Grady didn't object. He understood the need to stay close to walls, to keep exits in sight. He was halfway through sharpening his knife when he felt it. A sound too soft for an animal, too measured for wind. He stood slowly, looked out the window. The land had gone eerily still. No owls. No night insects. The kind of silence that came just before something broke. He opened the door and stepped out. At first, there was nothing. Then, over the ridge, shadows moved, figures on horseback, silent as drifting smoke. Grady froze, heart slamming once in his chest. They came slowly, surrounding the house without a word. 20 riders, maybe more. Apache. Painted faces, long braids, feathers and bone glinting under the moonlight. Weapons strapped to their backs, hands resting on rifle stocks and spear shaft. The front rider, tall and lean with scarred cheeks and eyes like cold iron, dismounted and stepped forward. Taya had followed him out, standing just behind. Grady didn't turn, didn't speak. The warrior looked at her, then at him, then spoke in a tongue Grady didn't understand. Taya responded, voice louder than he'd yet heard it, and filled with steel. The exchange was fast, clip. Tension cracked the air between each word. The warrior's gaze returned to Grady. He spoke again. This time slower, the tone unmistakably pointed. Taya translated. He says you are white. That this land was taken with fire and blood. That you walk on the bones of our people. Grady looked him in the eyes, unflinching. I buried my wife here. I built every board of this place with my hand. I don't want trouble. The warrior said something else. Taya hesitated, then translated. He asks why you gave me water. Grady didn't hesitate. Because she was dying. The Apache said nothing. He looked at Taya one last time, his face unreadable. Then he mounted his horse. One by one, the riders turned away and disappeared into the dark, like mist vanishing into the hills. Grady stood still, chest tight, until the last hoofbeat faded. Taya exhaled and turned back toward the house. They came for me. To see if I was dead or betrayed. He followed her inside, shutting the door behind them. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. He poured water into a basin, then leaned against the table, arms crossed. I suppose they'll be back. Taya nodded. If they believe I've turned, yes. He looked at her, this quiet girl with a storm in her spine. Did you? Her eyes flicked up, and something passed between them, an understanding neither had words for yet. No, she said. But I'm not sure where I stand anymore. Grady didn't answer. He simply walked to the window and stared into the dark. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, but it felt less like comfort and more like the opening of a gate he hadn't meant to lift. Tomorrow would come, and with it, consequences. But tonight there was breath in the house, and someone else watching the fire. Rain had not touched the land in nearly 3 months, and the earth groaned under its own thirst. Dust clung to every surface, turning sweat to mud on a man's skin and sapping the color from the grass until even the cattle looked faded. The morning after the Apache riders disappeared, Grady sat on the porch sharpening his hatchet. The girl was mending a leather strap with needle and sinew on the steps below him. She hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't offered any. She simply picked it up and worked like it belonged to her. They didn't speak for hours. Words weren't needed. The rhythm of work settled between them like an old song neither remembered learning. She moved slower than usual, her ribs still healing, but there was purpose in her motion. Every stitch was precise, every knot tied with the steadiness of someone who couldn't afford to be careless. By midday the wind shifted. It came in low gusts, carrying with it the strange weight of distant storms. Grady lifted his head, squinting at the west. Over the mountains, black clouds rolled like a rising tide. Thunder cracked faintly in the distance, a deep rumble that made the ground seem to flinch. "Storm," he muttered, almost to himself. Taya followed his gaze. Her face gave nothing away, but her hands stilled. She didn't fear the weather, but she respected it. In these parts, storms came with violence. They didn't knock politely, they broke down the door. Grady stood, groaning as his knees cracked. "Need to get the animals inside. Tie down the roof tarp. That back gate won't hold if wind hits it right." She stood too, nodding once. No hesitation. No fear. They worked fast. The air grew heavy, and the sky darkened until it was hard to tell late afternoon from dusk. Lightning began to flicker along the ridgelines like sparks chasing the edge of the world. The cattle sensed it too. They bawled nervously, huddling along the fence line. Grady rode out to the lower pen to herd them in, while Taya lashed the barn doors with rope and covered the gear with oiled canvas. Her braids snapped in the wind like a whip. Dust flew, stinging eyes and skin. The dog barked and skittered under the porch as the first droplets hissed into the dirt. Then the storm broke. Rain came sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the rafters. Thunder boomed so loud it rattled dishes on the shelf. Grady returned soaked and bleeding from a branch that had whipped his cheek. Taya met him at the barn with a lantern, her hair plastered to her face, her dress clinging to thin shoulders. "The fence," she shouted over the roar. "South end, it's gone." Grady swore under his breath. He grabbed a rope and limped toward the back of the property, pain flaring in his old leg injury. Taya followed without question, gripping a rusted pitchfork like a weapon. The southern fence had collapsed under a fallen tree. Worse, 2 calves were stuck in the rising wash, crying out as the floodwater swirled around them. Grady didn't hesitate. He leapt into the knee-deep mud, boots sinking, water biting cold. He reached one calf, wrapped the rope around its chest, and heaved. Taya braced herself and pulled too, anchoring the rope around a fence post. They dragged the animal out together, breathless, soaked, every muscle screaming. The second calf, smaller and frantic, flailed further downstream. "Stay put," Grady barked. He started after it, but the ground gave way beneath him. He fell, twisted, cried out as pain shot up his leg. Taya screamed his name, dropped the rope, and ran. She reached him as he tried to stand, water gushing around them. Without pause, she wedged her shoulder under his and helped him limp back toward solid ground. The log came fast, riding the current like a battering ram. Taya saw it before he did and shoved him hard. The log slammed into her side, knocking her off her feet. She went under, vanished into the murky brown. Grady's heart stopped. He lunged, ignoring the pain, diving toward where she'd fallen. His hands clawed through the water, found her arm, and yanked. They collapsed together on the bank, gasping, coughing, bruised. Lightning cracked overhead, and for the first time in years, Grady whispered a prayer. They crawled back to the barn, soaked and shaking. Inside, the storm raged, but they were alive. She sat on the dirt floor, arms wrapped around herself, eyes closed. He lit a fire in the brazier, tore a blanket in two, and handed her half. "You shouldn't ve jumped in," he said quietly. "You would have." Grady looked at her, truly looked. Mud streaked her face, her lip was bleeding, and her eyes burned with something fierce and defiant. "You've got iron in your bones, girl," he said. She almost smiled. He leaned back, wincing at the pain in his leg. "You any good with a gun? My brother taught me to shoot. Before he was killed." "He was Apache?" "Yes." Grady nodded slowly, understanding deepening like water in a well. "Then you know what's coming." She looked at him, steady. "You saved me. Twice now." He said nothing, only stared into the fire. Outside, the storm was passing, the rain lessening to a whisper. "I don't know where I belong anymore," she said finally. Grady didn't look at her, but his voice was low and sure. "Then maybe that means you get to choose." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. She watched him as though seeing him for the first time, not just a rancher, but a man shaped by loss and long silences, who had made room for her without asking anything in return. There was no pity in his gaze, only recognition. Outside, the wind settled into a low moan across the land. The worst had passed, but the sky still held its breath. Taya leaned against the wall, eyes drifting close. Grady threw another log on the fire and leaned back, pain dulled by the warmth and something else, a feeling he couldn't name. Not trust, not yet. But something close. In the distance, coyotes howled again, and Grady knew the quiet wouldn't last. Storms always gave way to harder questions, and something told him the answers would ride in soon, wearing dust and danger like old clothes. The morning sun rose pale and indifferent over the battered land, casting long shadows across the debris left by the storm. Mud still clung to the corral posts, and the smell of wet earth filled the air like something half forgotten. Grady limped along the porch, testing the stiffness in his leg. He moved slower now, with a slight hitch, but there was no time for rest. The flood had stolen half the fence, scattered tools across the ravine, and left his body aching with every breath. Inside, Taya had already swept out the barn and begun boiling water over the fire. She worked without being told, her presence no longer a question but a quiet fact of daily life. They had fallen into rhythm, not out of comfort but necessity. Trust hadn't been spoken aloud, yet it filled the silences between them. Still, something hung in the air, something unspoken and watchful, like the hush before a rifle cracks. Around mid-morning, the dog barked. Grady stepped off the porch, squinting toward the east. A dust trail curled across the horizon, faint but growing. Riders. At least 5, maybe 6. No Apache. No ceremony. These were white men, riding with purpose. He turned and called into the house. Taya. She appeared in the doorway instantly, reading the tension in his voice. Get inside. Take the rifle behind the stove. She hesitated. You know them? No, he said grimly, and that's the problem. By the time the horses skidded to a stop in front of the house, Grady was already standing on the porch, shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. The men didn't smile. Their leader was a broad-chested brute with tobacco-stained teeth and a scar beneath one eye. He leaned on his saddle horn, sizing Grady up like a man appraising livestock. Morning, he drawled. Grady nodded once. Can't say it is. The man chuckled. We heard a little something riding down from Dry River. Story about a rancher nursing an Apache girl back to health. Figured that kind of charity might need correcting. Grady didn't flinch. This is my land. Funny thing about that, the man said, spitting into the dust. You got no deed filed in Lincoln County. Nothing official. Which means it's just dirt until someone claims it proper. Seems I already did. Another man to the left shifted in his saddle, resting a hand near his pistol. You gonna risk your life over a redskin? Grady's voice stayed low. She's under my roof. That's all you need to know. From the shadows inside, Taya watched. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept them tight on the Winchester's stock. She recognized these men. Their kind had swept through her people like plague, burning, looting, leaving bodies and silence in their wake. If they came closer, she would shoot. Scar-Eye grinned, leaning forward. Here's what's gonna happen. You hand her over, we won't burn your place to the ground. You can even keep your crippled leg and whatever pride's left rattling in your chest. Grady stared at him for a long moment. The breeze moved his coat slightly, revealing the glint of the revolver on his belt. No, he said simply. The grin faded. That your final word? It's the only one that matters. The gunshot came fast. Not from the men, but from inside the house. Taya's bullet struck the ground inches from the second rider's boot. The horse reared, neighing wildly. Dust flew. Panic rippled through the group. Grady used the moment, drawing and firing with precision born of necessity. The third man fell with a cry, blood splashing onto the saddle horn. Gunfire erupted, loud and chaotic. Grady dove behind the porch post as bullets splintered wood all around him. Taya fired again from the window, forcing the men back. One was hit in the shoulder, screaming as he tumbled from his mount. The others turned their horses, retreating under fire, hooves thundering into the hills. Then silence. Grady sat back against the porch, chest heaving. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and stinging. His arm throbbed from where a bullet had grazed him, but he was alive. He looked up as Taya stepped out, face expressionless, rifle still in hand. "You all right?" she asked. "I will be," he said, managing a pained grin. "You?" She nodded. "You didn't hesitate. Neither did you." They buried the body out past the creek, under a crooked juniper. Grady didn't say a prayer, but he stood still for a long time, hat pressed to his chest. Taya watched him, silent. That night, they patched the windows and reinforced the door with plank. No more talk of waiting. They both knew there'd be more men eventually. Revenge came slow, but certain. Later, as they sat near the hearth, the fire casting their shadows long on the walls, Taya finally spoke. "They'll come again. Not just for me. For the land. I know. They don't care who we are. Only what we threaten." Grady turned toward her, eyes steady. "And what's that?" "Survival without their permission." He leaned back, running a hand over his face. "Then we make it harder for them." She nodded, then added softly, "My people wouldn't have spared you. I figured. But I'll stay. If you'll have me." Grady didn't answer right away. He looked into the fire, letting the silence draw out like a deep breath. "I've lived a long time alone. Too long. This place, it was dying before you got here. You lit something again." Taya's voice was quiet. "You did that first. With water." Outside, the wind stirred, lifting dust from the ridge. The stars blinked overhead, distant and indifferent, but steady. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt watched. Not with threat, but with promise. In the days that followed, they built together. Fixed what had been broken. Reinforced the fence, repaired the barn, cleared the creek bed. Taya began planting vegetables where wild grass once choked the yard. She laughed once, just once, when the dog stole her boot. Grady didn't mention it, but the sound stayed with him long after. Neither of them spoke about what they'd lost. They didn't have to. The land had already taken too much. What remained was not built on pity, but grit. Late one evening, as dusk turned the hills purple and gold, Grady handed Taya a tool belt of her own. It was patched, old, but sturdy. She took it without a word, slinging it around her waist like she'd been born wearing it. "You're part of this place now," he said. She met his eyes. "Then I'll protect it. Like you did me." Grady smiled faintly, the kind of smile earned through hardship. Outside, the shadows stretched long. Somewhere in the distance, drums echoed faintly, soft, slow, not of war, but of memory. And the ranch, once a monument to silence, now breathed with two heartbeats instead of one.